Memory's Blade, Infinity's End, Book 8, by Eric Warren. Narrated by Larry Gorman. 1. Caspian Rabot stared at the ornamented piece of metal, which once meant so much to him, but now seemed hollow. It seemed to stare back, taunting him, challenging him in a way, and he had to turn away from the garments he'd laid out on the bed in his quarters. It had been 2 days since they had arrived at the border planet of Sisk in the Hamel system, on the edge of what used to be Coalition space. But since there was no more Coalition, he figured this was open territory, ready for anyone to do with it as they wished. 18 years had passed since the Athru had invaded and decimated the Coalition from the inside, attempting to eradicate every human in existence. Worse yet, there was a good chance the humans left on the ship temporarily under his command, the Tempest, were the last in existence. Cass turned to the uniform. He'd been going back and forth about putting it on again, trying to decide if wearing it even made a difference anymore. The rest of the crew still wore their uniforms, still adhered to the command structure of the Coalition, still performed their duties to the best of their ability. They were an exceptional group of people. Now it was his job to command them. But putting the uniform back on had never felt right, not since his arrest. He'd already tried this once, when he tried to pretend like the last 7 years, 7 for him, 25 for anyone not on his ship, hadn't happened. And he'd sworn never to go back. At the time, he'd been sure it was the right call. The notion of even returning to the Coalition had been a bad idea. It seemed fate had a sense of humor, because here he stood, right back where he'd been before, facing a similar choice. Cass tapped his comm to check the time. It wouldn't be long before Evie was ready to leave for the planet, and he couldn't afford to dawdle any longer. He picked up the uniform, removed the metal insignia denoting the rank of captain from the breast, and affixed it to his civilian jacket. It was crooked, but it didn't much matter. He was in a hurry, and it would have to do. He passed the mirror on his way out, which was something he'd done 100 times before. But his reflection held him a moment. In the mirror stood the acting captain of the USCS Tempest. Before this, any hope of captaining a Coalition starship had left the realm of what he considered possible years ago. But here he was, in command of what might be the last of the Coalition fleet. Had anyone asked him if he was proud that he'd finally made it, he would lie and tell them yes, despite the terrible situation, he was stepping up to do his duty. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel like an imposter, even if part of it had come to him by accident. Becoming a captain of a starship had been one of his dreams from a young age. Though if someone had told him what he would have to go through to reach this point, he would have run away screaming and cursing. Cass adjusted the insignia just a smidge so the light caught it, and he frowned. It didn't look right on him, but he wasn't sure why. Instead of spending any more time in front of the accursed mirror, he turned and strode through his door. Had he been moving any faster, he would have collided with Saturina Yan, who stood just on the other side, her hand out to the call panel. "Whoa!" She jumped back. "In a hurry?" She took stock of him. "Where's your uniform?" Cass maneuvered around her, trying to make it look like he'd known she was there and was deft enough to avoid the collision on purpose. Decided against it. Too itchy. "Wait a second." She came up beside him as he walked with purpose down the corridor. "You told me it was better if the crew felt united, and wearing the uniform would help you do that." Those had been his words, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. It was as if putting that uniform back on represented a betrayal of who he had become ever since the Coalition had tried and convicted him for treason. He wasn't an officer anymore, even though he'd been acting like one ever since they'd begun this journey. "It doesn't matter anyway," he said. "It's only temporary, until all this," he gestured around them, "is over." You can't be serious about relinquishing command back to Diazol, Saturina said. Her voice hardened. She hadn't witnessed it, but by now most of the crew knew their former captain, Evelyn Diazol, had killed 7 members of the crew, and many of them didn't care that she'd been under an alien influence at the time. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, Cass replied. With everything going on, I barely had time to sleep, much less ponder a future without the Coalition. Right now, we just need to focus on surviving. I'll worry about all the little details later. Despite arriving in orbit of this planet 2 days ago, Cass had put a hold on any visits, since the last planet they'd visited had threatened to blow them out of the sky, and they had been one of the original framers of the Coalition. He wasn't sure what kind of reception they might get heading down to a border world. That's a little detail? Saturina ran her hand through her cropped platinum hair. He could tell she was frustrated by his lack of a decision, and he didn't blame her. She was also under a lot of pressure, having taken over what remained of the Space Corps, those that weren't dead or in the brig. Was there something you needed? He asked, realizing she hadn't been outside his door without a reason, though he hated how harsh his own voice sounded. She seemed not to pick up on it. I just spent 6 hours in the brig, interrogating the prisoners. A good look at her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Went that well, huh? She shook her head. They are determined to stay loyal to Ravenkel. I think they see her as a martyr now. All any of them would say was Diazol should be in there with them. Cass scoffed. Right. So they can beat the hell out of her? I don't think so. You have to admit, it looks pretty strange, Saturina said. The one member of the crew who actually killed— Okay, I get it, he said, talking over her. Actually killed people is still walking around free, Saturina finished. I know you don't want to hear it, but they have a point. She needs to be confined. Cass tried not to let his frustration show. He and Saturina had decided to begin a romantic relationship only a few days before. But before they'd barely begun, this contention had come up between them. Despite Saturina not agreeing with Ravenkel's drastic move to wrest command of the ship from him and Evie, she wasn't convinced their former captain wasn't still a threat. It made Cass think the whole attempt at a relationship might be doomed from the start. I don't know how many times we have to go over this. It wasn't her. She thought they were the enemy. And how long until she makes that mistake again? What happens if it's you beside her next time? Or me? Are you really willing to put the lives of the crew at stake on a belief? He stopped in the middle of the corridor, turning to her. I know you think I'm playing favorites here, but I trust her. She's not dangerous. Not anymore. Saturina's eyes slid to the side. If you say so. That doesn't mean I don't value your opinion. I know you're just looking out for the crew, he said, softening his tone. One of us has to, she countered. But despite the unspoken accusation, there was a smile in her voice. I'm just relaying the will of the masses. Cass headed back down the corridor again. Good thing this isn't a democracy, then. She caught up with him again. You can be a real ass sometimes. Trust me, it was Box's favorite thing to remind me of back on the reasonable excuse. It's one of my defining characteristics. Just be glad you didn't know me back when I worked for the Sargans. He'd been aware the past few days just how much had changed for him ever since he decided to come back to the Coalition. He wasn't sure if it was seeing his society decimated, or just the possibility that everyone he knew from his old life was dead and gone, that had made him roll around in the memories of that harsher life. But he had, nonetheless. Saturina rolled her eyes. I'm glad I didn't. He could sense her frustration only growing. Once we understand what this beacon is, and why it has brought us here, I promise I'll make her go through a full diagnostic with Zax. And if the doc finds anything out of the ordinary, we can put her in stasis. But look at it from her point of view. She feels worse about it than anyone. After all, she killed the woman she loved. I guess. Saturina kept her eyes down. The prisoners did say one other thing. They want better accommodations. Cass almost laughed out loud. What do they think this is? A luxury cruise liner? It's called the Brig for a reason. She shrugged. How about you put yourself in their shoes? We know there was no local magistrate or court to hear their case, so they can't be tried. And we can't drop them off at a starbase where the cells are larger and better equipped. For most of them, they figure they'll be spending the rest of their lives behind force barriers. Would you want to do that in a 20 by 20 cell? Cass considered it. Okay, you're right. I know. They couldn't keep them in those tiny rooms forever. At some point, they needed to have some sort of freedom. He just hadn't been expecting to take on 6 prisoners all at once. Though, if the situation had been reversed, and Chief Raffenkill's plan had worked, Cass suspected she wouldn't have bothered with the formality of the Brig, and instead ejected anyone into space who didn't agree with her taking control of the ship. Once we figured out what we're dealing with on the planet, I'll assign an engineering team that can perhaps convert one of the cargo areas into a more permanent and larger Brig. Will that satisfy them? Probably not. But it's the best they can hope for given their situation, she replied. If they weren't human, I'd pick a rock and leave them on it, Cass said. But given what they knew about the Athru and their insane desire to destroy humanity, Cass thought that might be too cruel. On this ship, they had a type of dampener built by a group of humans who had spent 18 years evading the Athru, which meant every human on the ship was safe, or as safe as they could be given the circumstances. But if he were to drop them off on some planet, it would be a death sentence. Any other good news? Saturina hooked her arm around his for just a moment. Nothing that can't wait until later. Then she let it go. Despite the fact they operated in different parts of the military, what was left of it, they didn't want to give the appearance of impropriety, since, technically, the head of the Space Corps was supposed to report to the captain of the ship on which they were serving. Though Cass had made it clear, as soon as he was in command, that rule had gone by the wayside. He didn't want to have to order Saturina to do anything. If she disagreed with his decision, that was fine. They would find another way. But he wasn't going to put her in that situation. They reached the doors of the hypervator. You headed down to the base too? He asked, hopeful. He liked being in her presence. She had a silent strength about her he found reassuring. Nope. I've got to go bust Riot for being late yesterday, which means he gets extra duties this morning. I'm headed back that way. She hooked a thumb behind her. And Cass realized she'd just made that whole walk not because she wanted to relay news, but because she liked being around him too. He grinned. Make sure you give him an extra kick in the ass for me. You can count on it. She was halfway back down the corridor when the hypervator doors opened, and Cass stepped inside. 2. Evelyn Diazol sat in the pilot's chair of the shuttle Calypso, her head back against the headrest, trying not to think about the possibilities of what might be on the planet below them. She'd spent the past 2 days agonizing over what or who might be waiting for her down there. More than once she'd snuck down to the bay to steal the shuttle and find out for herself, only to turn around and go back to her quarters when she thought about betraying the crew again. Cass had put his faith in her that she wasn't a danger to the ship, and that was something she needed to respect. Sometimes she still felt like she had the potential to be dangerous, despite the fact she'd excised the Athru part of herself that had been responsible for so much death. That dormant aspect of her psyche that had been awoken when she'd encountered the other Athru, Dagnya, was a vile, ruthless monster, and Evie was glad to be rid of her. She drew a deep breath in through her nose and let it back out again while she rolled the small black marble Cass had given her around in her hand. While the orb brought her a level of comfort, it also carried with it a shadow. Who had it belonged to? And what had Marshall wanted her to do with it when he gave it to Cass with his dying breath? It was obvious it was a beacon, as she could practically sense where on the planet it wanted her to go. But what did that mean? Was it Athru technology? Or something else? All these questions had been burning in her mind, and at the moment, it took all her willpower not to fire up the engines right now and blast down to the planet to find out. Her comm chirped. "Diazol here," she said. "I'm on my way down. Are you sure I can't persuade you to take a security team with you?" Cass asked from the other end. She shook her head, even though she knew he couldn't see it. "I'm not putting anyone else at risk. All I need is your authorization to leave. You don't even need to come down." "Yes, I do," he said, and ended the transmission. Evie huffed. She hoped he wasn't planning on making a speech about how he needed to come with her. While she wouldn't mind the company, this was something she needed to do on her own. And now that Cass was in charge of the ship, his place was up here. She might have to remind him of that fact. Evie leaned over the shuttle's main control panel and entered a series of codes that brought all the main systems online. No sense in not being prepared. She double-checked all the comm lines for the shuttle and took note there was still no communications traffic coming from the planet. That in itself was odd, since Sisk was a fully developed world and had been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The planet was unique in that more than one intelligent species had evolved, 12 in fact, and each had somehow not killed the others in competition for the planet during its long and troubled history. It was quite a marvel all 12 species had managed to find a way to work together, at least in theory. But power changed hands quickly on Sisk, which made getting things done difficult. It had been one of the primary reasons the planet had never been admitted to the United Coalition. By the time they were ready to apply, another government would take power and change their minds. Fortunately, these days, most of the fighting was done on the floors of the Senate, rather than in a battlefield. But with 12 different Senates situated all over the planet, the comm waves were almost always full of arguments. Which was why Evie found the silence so unsettling. "Hey!" Evie jumped, then turned in her seat to see Cass had poked his head inside the door. "By Garth, announce yourself next time or something." She held a hand to her chest. Her heart, which had already been beating faster than normal, was now running like a drive capacitor on overload. He gave her a sheepish smile. "Sorry. I figured you heard me. I know you said you refused to take a security team down with you." She held up a hand. "Don't start again. I told you, I'm not putting anyone else at risk." He arched an eyebrow. "At risk from what might be down there, or at risk from you?" "Both," she said, before she thought about what she'd said. "I just don't want to see any more of the crew get hurt on my account." He nodded. "Well, I can't exactly let you go down by yourself. Not only is it a breach of regulation," she scoffed at this. Since when had he been so strict on regulation? "But allowing you to go alone would put you at risk, and that's not acceptable either. So you get a travel buddy." She screwed up her face. "A travel buddy?" Before she could finish, the metal body of Box pushed past Cass and strode into the cabin, walking confidently toward Evie and taking a seat in the seat adjacent to hers. "Captain?" Box nodded, as his eyes blinked in an errant pattern. "Wait a second," Evie said, standing. "I can't take Box. He's just as vulnerable as anyone else. Don't you remember what I did to him back in that pyramid?" "Ah, but you are forgetting a very important point, Captain," Box said, his voice dripping with superiority. "You do not have your insanely sharp sword with you this time, and I am armed with 12 types of poisons, each that could kill a Tetrian rhino." Evie took a step back. 12 poisons? Box's eyes blinked again, in a pattern she recognized as amusement. "I'm only kidding. I have 2 poisons that could kill a Tetrian rhino. The other 10 would only increase his sexual prowess, make him more virile for the females." "Box," Cass said, warning in his voice. "Okay, fine. I have no poisons, just a sedative." He held up one of his fingers, which partially retracted to a needle. "But don't worry. I'm sure we won't need to use it." Evie shot a side glance at Cass. I'm not going down with him. Why not? I love field trips, Box whined. She turned to him. It's nothing personal, Box. I enjoy your company. But this message, whatever it is, it's meant for me. How many times do I have to say it? I don't want to put anyone else in harm's way. You mean you don't want anyone to get in the way, Cass said from behind her, having entered the shuttle properly. I didn't say that, she replied. But it's true. She didn't want to have to worry about anyone else down there. Sisk had been her home at one point. She felt like it was her birthright to return on her own terms. Bottom line is either he goes with you or nobody goes, Cass replied. Minimum levels of redundancy. If I send you down there without an escort and we lose contact, what then? I'll have to tell Saturina to prep for a rescue mission. Saturina, huh? I've never heard you refer to her by her first name before, Evie said, failing to keep a smile from forming on her face. Something you want to share with the class? The boss and Captain Jan have decided to enter into a sexual contract, Box said. It was bound to happen eventually. His self-satisfaction routine is woefully inadequate. Cass sputtered, and Evie almost burst out laughing, but managed to contain herself. His self-satisfaction routine? Oh, yes. Back on the reasonable excuse, you could hear everything if you put your audio receptor to very specific points on the hull. There was often a lot of thumping, followed by a lot of crying, followed by a lot more thumping. Very unhealthy. Thank you, Cass said through gritted teeth. Say one more word about it, and I'm taking your voice processor for good. Box leaned over to Evie. He's very sensitive about his alone time, so a new relationship should be good for him. She glanced back to Cass, whose face had gone a bright shade of red, though the deep breaths he was taking helped lessen the color. Can we just agree on this arrangement so I can get back to my duties? Whatever you say, boss, Box said, spinning in his chair so it faced the large window on the shuttle. I'm ready to go. Cass stared at Evie a moment, and his features softened. Are you sure you don't want to take any weapons? Not even a pulse rifle? She shook her head. She'd purposely left the sword in her room. If it hadn't belonged to her grandmother, she would have already thrown it in the recycler and had it melted down for component molecules. But as it was, she couldn't quite find a way to part with it, despite all the death it had caused. But that didn't mean she had to carry it with her anymore. I'll be fine, especially if Mr. Needlefingers over here is quick. I don't get the sense there is anything on that planet that will hurt me. It's not like I don't know where I'm going. Cass nodded. We'll keep an open comm line just in case. Both you and Box will be connected to the bridge at all times. He turned to the robot. And keep the personal stuff to a minimum, huh? The entire ship doesn't need to know your every inner thought. No promises, Box said, throwing up a waving hand without turning around. Cass rolled his eyes, turning back to Evie. Good luck down there. I hope you find what you're looking for. And if for some reason you do run into trouble, let us know. Thanks. The glint of metal caught her eye, and she was drawn to the captain's insignia he'd pinned on his jacket. She'd missed it before, but it looked like he was finally taking steps to becoming the ship's new commanding officer, even if they were baby steps. She approached him and drew him into a hug, and she felt him go rigid. In all the time they'd known each other, they'd kept physical contact to a minimum, so she didn't quite know why she'd taken the extra step to hug him. It just seemed like the right thing to do. She pulled back, and without saying anything else, returned to the pilot's chair. She heard him exit, and once the shuttle's sensors confirmed he was clear, she closed the hatch on the side. Box leaned back over once the pressure had sealed. Well, that was intense. 3. The shuttle rumbled under them as Evie brought it through the top layers of Sisk's atmosphere. The system's star Hamel burned white in the distance, illuminating this side of the planet. Below them, Sisk itself stretched wide, Its browns and greens mixed to form the land, which abruptly ended at the few light blue seas that dotted the landscape. Whereas habitable worlds were typically more water than land, Sisk was the opposite, as it only had one ocean, which cut through the main continent of the planet from pole to pole. The rest of the landscape was peppered by what looked like small lakes from high above, but were actually massive seas in themselves up close, though most were cut off from each other, except for a few connected by giant artificial waterways built by the indigenous Sisk species hundreds of years ago. It was a view Evie was used to, and coming back to it after having been away for such a long time sent a pang of nostalgia reverberating through her. Once she'd passed her pilot's test and had her license, she used to see this view daily, after taking up the rentable shuttles as many times as she could afford in a month. She'd spend hours up here, watching the planet below as she practiced her skills, becoming as familiar as possible with the controls until the shuttle itself felt like an extension of her body. It was the one part of her adolescence she'd really enjoyed, and diving back through the atmosphere brought it all back to the forefront. "You lived in Lacal, correct?" Box asked, as the last remnants of the inkiness of space disappeared and they were enveloped in bluish-green atmosphere. "Outside Lacal, but yes, it was the closest port. We'll have to land there. Sisk doesn't permit private landings, as all—" She broke off, a disturbing thought crossing her mind. "Captain?" Box asked. "Where is all the air traffic?" Evie asked, realizing no other transports were flying through the atmosphere. Usually, the sky would have been full of them, each in their designated lanes. The lanes themselves were still there. She could see the hovering markers floating as she took the ship lower into the atmosphere. "I don't know, but I'm guessing this isn't normal." Evie shook her head. Not at all. She'd never seen the sky so empty, except when a large storm had been approaching. But as she checked the atmospheric sensors, everything on this side of the planet was projected to be clear all day. "This doesn't make any sense. Cass did say he detected life forms down there, right? The planet isn't empty. I didn't dream that, right?" "As far as we could tell, there should be 6 billion life forms down there," Box said. "That's what the initial population scan showed." A pit had formed in Evie's stomach, and grew heavier by the minute. For the first time since she thought about heading to the surface, she was glad Cass insisted someone come with her. What if the Athru had killed everyone on the surface and replaced them with nothing but Athru soldiers? But Sisk wasn't strategically important. If it had been, one of the other factions would have snapped it up hundreds of years ago. There was a reason it was a border world. It was remote, had few resources, and the population was just volatile enough to discourage tourism. Sometimes ships used it as a stepping stone to reach Okar or Beta Strongren, but it was rare. "Well, unless they want us to land in the middle of the street, they're going to have to respond," she said, tapping the comm. "Sisk Control, this is Calypso, requesting landing access for Lacal. Please direct." Silence on the other end. Evie's heart started to pick up and pace again, and this time it wasn't because she'd just been startled. "Should we turn back?" Box asked. No. Evie hadn't come all this way and gone through all she had just to be turned away now. She was landing this ship and following the orb's beacon if it meant dropping down right on her old house, or what was left of it. Just as she made a course adjustment, the comm sparked to life. "Shuttle Calypso, you are cleared for Pad 4, Lacal Primary Terminal." The voice was harsh, yet smooth, a trait Evie recognized as belonging to one of Sisk's indigenous species, the Ashkazians. They were the species which she had first thought Regis species might be related to, as they shared many of the same characteristics. She couldn't help but wonder if it might have been a good idea to bring him along too, just so they didn't stand out as much. It wasn't as if there were a lot of humans on Sisk, even when she was young. "At least that's something," she said, adjusting the heading to match an approach vector to Lacal's primary terminal. "I've never had the pleasure of seeing Sisk. I understand it's a very diverse place." Evie kept an eye on the readings, but the computer would do most of the landing from here on out. That's putting it mildly. Until I came to Devil's Gate to find you and Cass, I had never seen another place with so many different species working together. The city of LaCall rose before them over the horizon. Being one of the smaller towns, it didn't have a lot of large buildings, though there were a few that topped out at 40 or 50 stories. Yet the business district was very compact, encompassing only about 5 square city blocks. Beyond that, small complexes dotted the landscape around the city itself, with farms and houses taking up equal measures not far from the tallest buildings. The primary terminal itself was the second tallest building, with a myriad of pads jutting out from the building at different heights, only about half occupied. Evie brought the shuttle around and landed on the circular pad with the CISC number 4 painted on it and began the shutdown sequence. She took a deep breath, regarding Box. I guess it's time to see what's out there. Or who? Box lowered his voice. Evie turned up her nose. Do you have to make everything seem so menacing? Hey, Box replied, if I'm going to be your bodyguard, it means I need to act tough. I can't decide if I should go with mindless automaton. An ear-piercing siren sounded through the cabin, and Evie clapped her hands over her ears to shut out the sound. Citizen, move away! It was Box's voice, but like it had been shoved through a loudspeaker. The siren ceased. Or do I go for silent but deadly? He stood, quicker than she could follow, and within a millisecond his face was millimeters from hers, his yellow eyes boring down on her. Did you just threaten my friend, punk? He said in a low growl. She shoved him away, uncomfortable with him so close. How about you just act normal, and if someone tries anything, you stick them with your poisons or whatever you've got? Ah, Box whined. But I really like the menacing one. I've been practicing. And let me tell you, Zax does not like to be intimidated. I'm sure she doesn't. Evie turned in her seat and headed for the main hatch. Come on. The hatch opened to the CISC air, which was dry and warm. But as it was still early morning on this part of the planet, it wasn't as hot as it would get once Howell got high in the sky. CISC sat closer to her star than many other planets in the habitable zone, which meant the planet was hot and stayed that way. The only place it ever snowed was at the extreme poles. Evie led the way to the connecting hatch, which took them into the building itself. She placed her palm on the small pad beside the door, which registered her genetic ID and tagged it to the shuttle, in the event it was lost or stolen. The screen below flashed, asking for compensation for parking. Damn it, Evie said. I forgot they still use Cassope here. I hope my account is still active. Box perked up. If not, I'm sure we can arrange a simple forgery. Cass would never let me do it back when we worked for the Sargans. But this might be... Got it, she said, triumphant. I can't believe I remembered my old code. She led him to the closest hypervator, which would take them down to the street level. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Certainly nothing to explain why there wasn't any air or comm traffic. I kind of expected more of a greeting. Perhaps they're all too busy to care, Box said. How often did you greet every person who came on board while you were captain? It hadn't been a long enough stint for her to give him a proper response, but it did bring up another point. When you're addressing me, I'd appreciate it if you don't use my rank anymore. I'm not exactly regulation. What should I call you? Box asked. How about Evie? I'm not sure we're there yet. She stared at him, sighing. Fine. What do you think's appropriate? He shrugged his metal shoulders. Parolee? Very funny. I'm serious. It's weird not having a title for you. He paused. Evie. I suppose I could say human Evie, though that doesn't work either, because you're not fully human. Person, perhaps? What do they say here? Similist? She nodded. It's the generic term everyone uses for groups, since there are so many different kinds. And often groups are made up of many different species. Why not just say Siskians, or people? They stepped out of the hypervator into the large lobby, which was likewise empty. Usually, it would be bustling with the activity of people coming and going. But there was still no one around. "It's a Sisk thing," she replied, not thinking about what he was asking. "They prefer the term because they feel it sets them apart from other planets. It may be the only thing all 12 species agree on." There wasn't even a guard keeping watch over the place. Evie glanced out the doors and could see individuals walking by, but the streets were relatively empty. "I bet you can't name them all," he taunted. And before she could even disagree, the words came out of her mouth automatically. "Ashkazian, Krillik, Arungu, Ub, Pitarax, Kral, Kormorph, Bedru, Locula, Hidehorn, Virlulis. And the one no one has ever had any contact with, except in the history books, Modix." "Oh," Box replied, "I guess you can." "It's one of the first things we learn in school here." She motioned for Box to follow her. The door slid open, and they were greeted with a warm rush of Sisk air again, though this time it was grittier, not as buoyant as it had been up above. "This is really weird. I've never seen Lakal so deserted." On the other side of the street, another Ashkazian strolled away, his head down and shoulders hunched under his cloak. To their left, Evie caught sight of a Kormorph go into a nearby building. She wasn't sure, but she could have sworn the Kormorph looked at her first. It was hard to tell with them. Their eyes were so small. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something sinister hung in the air, and she didn't like how it made her feel. "Let's get going," she said, glancing back at Box, who only stared at her. "Whatever you say. This is your show. My job is to administer first aid, or an ass-kicking, whichever comes first." "Let's hope neither," she replied, heading down the main thoroughfare that bisected Lakal. She thought about hiring a ground transport, as a few sat meters away from them, but decided against it. It wasn't a far journey to her old house, and she liked feeling the air against her skin. In her pocket, the orb seemed to vibrate with energy. So far, they were on the right track. "Your business?" Startled, Evie turned to see a Bedru security officer standing off to the side, and her heart pounded in her throat. How had she missed him before? His singular black eyes seemed to bore right into Evie. "Human, state your business on Sisk." "Personal," she replied, trying not to stare at his 6 identical gills set below his long nose, which itself sat below the black eye. Right behind the eye, 2 identical fleshy ridges flared out along his back, where they tapered at the end. Though along this entire ridge was a set of spikes, almost like teeth, curved inward, giving the impression that the ridges were jaws that could clamp down on something that might be unfortunate enough to find its way in there. He stood on 4 legs, each of them long and lanky, but still he wore a modified security uniform. Bedru didn't typically speak, so it took Evie's brain a minute to process the fact he was still talking to her. "Your personal business here?" he asked. "I'm sorry?" Evie replied. "I said, how long will you conduct your personal business here?" She hadn't considered it. Maybe a few days, or even a week? She couldn't be sure. "Not long," she lied. "Half a day." This seemed to satisfy the security officer, and he uttered a harumph before trundling off in the other direction, his set of legs working in tandem to get him down the street. "So that's a similist?" Box asked. "Yup. Bedru species." "Fascinating," Box replied. "I can't wait to meet the others." 4. The hypervator doors opened, and Cass strode onto the bridge. "Do we have eyes on them?" he asked, rounding the captain and executive officers' chairs that sat in the middle of the room. His new first officer, Commander Hank Graydon, stood from the captain's chair and moved to the XO station. "They entered the atmosphere a few moments ago," he said, keeping his steely eyes on the main view screen that took up the front wall of the bridge. "We're tracking them as they're approaching the city. Hank was a no-nonsense soldier who joined the crew when Tempest had returned from unexplored space. He was one of the few survivors of the Athru attacks, along with Cass's former crewmate, Samaya Geisen, who now occupied the bridge engineering position. Cass had only recently found out it was Samaya who was responsible for sabotaging the SIL weapon he tried so hard to keep out of Coalition hands. Cass glanced over to his Utuburo operations officer, Zal. "Any word from the surface?" "No, Captain," Zal replied. "Still nothing. They are down there. They're just not talking." Cass settled into his seat. They have to be worried. A Coalition starship showing up in their airspace out of nowhere 18 years after the Coalition was supposedly destroyed? It would unnerve me. "Everyone responds differently," Samaya said. She was right. When they tried to approach Zal's home planet after returning, they'd been met with a small armada of ships and a threat to leave the system immediately. Samaya had told Cass of other instances where once friendly planets had fired on them. The collapse of the Coalition had produced a dire effect on all of the species who had once been members, sowing distrust, hate, and fear throughout the quadrant. It was hard to believe, after nearly 2,000 years of solidarity, things had fallen apart so quickly. "They're landing at Lacal's primary port of call," Graydon said, checking his screen to the side of the executive officer's chair. "Any resistance?" Cass asked. "Nothing. Though I've noticed a lack of air traffic in addition to the silent comms." Cass addressed his helm officer, Lieutenant Rond, a man who at one time had been complicit in attempting to disassemble Box and get Cass kicked off the ship. Cass hadn't had much interaction with him since, but Evie had seemed to trust him, so Cass had extended that trust as well. "Lieutenant, are we in a stationary orbit? If we need to go down there, I don't want to circle halfway around the planet before we can descend." "Adjusting heading now, sir," Ron said. "We'll be locked in just above Lacal." He nodded to the navigation officer to his right, Ensign River. They often worked in tandem to keep the ship on track, and Cass thought he remembered seeing a report come through the captain's bulletins praising River for her exceptional work. He was still getting used to all the ins and outs of the job. There were sure to be things he missed. River's performance review might be one of them. Cass sat back, taking a breath. It felt like they'd all been running on overdrive ever since they'd left Coalition space the first time. So much had happened, and so many friends had been lost they needed some time to reflect. They needed time to mourn. Even though it had only been a couple of weeks from Cass's perspective, Captain Green had been in stasis down at the morgue for almost 18 years. He deserved a proper send-off, as did the rest of the crew who had died in the interim. But Cass had been reluctant to have any more funerals because of what it might have done to Evie. Now that she was in full control of her facilities again, perhaps it was time. When she returned to the ship, he would broach the subject with her. After all, they needed to perform a service for Laura as well.
Cass? Captain, sorry."
Samaya piped up. He blinked, coming out of his reverie, turning his attention to her.
"I think we have a problem."
Cass and Hank walked over to her station. "What happened? Is it something with the shuttle?"
"No, but Hank, you remember when we picked up those trace filament trails a couple of years back, and they turned out to lead to Athru ships?"
Hank forced out a laugh. "Yeah. We thought we might have found a way to track them." Samaya turned to Cass.
"It turned out to be nothing more than a side effect of the Athru entering and leaving their time bubbles. All it really told us was they had been in the general area lately. But I'm reading the same thing from the surface."
"Shit," Hank said, turning to Talia, their tactical officer. "Ensign, any indication of hostiles in the area?"
"Not that we can detect," Talia replied. "So they might be in those damn bubbles."
Cass kept his attention on Samaya's screen.
"So this means they've been on the surface recently?"
She nodded.
"And close. Look, the filament isn't far from Diazol's old house."
Cass tapped his comm. "Evie? Box? Come in. We're seeing potential Athru activity in your area." There was no response. He glanced at Zal, who double-checked his instruments. "I'm sorry, Captain. Someone is blocking our transmitters at the source." Shit. Cass tapped his comm again. Chief, prepare to scramble the squad. We might have a problem.
What kind of problem? Saturina asked.
The only kind that matters, he replied.
Is it just me, or are they avoiding us? Box asked, as he and Evie made their way down the main thoroughfare of Lacal, the buildings on both sides of them growing shorter as they walked. Above them, the sky was clear, and the oppressive heat of Hamel radiated down on them. The back of her neck warmed, and she adjusted her hair to minimize the sunburn. They're avoiding us. Back when I was a kid, it was rare to see a human on Sisk, but the Similists didn't go out of their way to walk around me. But now,
it's like you got the plague, Box offered. Ahead of them, a Locula woman crossed the street, keeping her head low.
Don't worry, she's not infectious,
Box called.
I'm a doctor.
The woman only hurried along faster.
Don't do that, Evie hissed through her teeth.
What? Assuage anxiety? I can't help it. I'm designed to help.
For some reason, that doesn't make me feel any better. Let's just get there.
Evie rolled the orb around in her hand, still inside her pocket. It practically thrummed with energy, as if it were being called home. And somehow she didn't think it was a coincidence it was being called back to her home, the only place she'd ever known before leaving for the Coalition. They continued on for another 15 minutes, leaving the tall buildings of Lacal behind for the open and deserted roads of the outskirts. In the distance, the Selassie Mountains rose, their caps as bare as she'd always remembered them. During one of her first trips with the shuttle, she'd landed on the cap of one of the mountains, only to find the air still warm and the ground hard, with little growing there. She'd hoped it would be cooler the higher she flew, but even the mountains couldn't escape the oppressive heat. She glanced back at the star rising higher in the sky. In a few hours they'd have to get inside. The heat would be unbearable. She only hoped it was enough time to do what they'd come for, whatever it was.
Here we are, she said as they approached the long drive off the main road.
At one time it had been well kept, but now overgrown spike grass and weeds encroached on the edges, and the drive was cracked and brittle, like the shell of an egg. Evie gripped the orb tighter. Nice place, Box said, staring at the long path up to what was left of a house in the distance.
Don't start,
Evie said, heading down the drive. The house itself had once been a 2-story, but a fire sometime after she'd vacated had put an end to that. Only part of the frame of the first floor remained. Charred remains of the building were strewn around at different angles, as if no one had even bothered to clean up the mess after the fire. She remembered walking up this drive every day after lessons, dreading returning to that house, but complying anyway. And now here she was, anticipating returning, but still feeling that hollow pit in her stomach as they approached. She drew her ponytail over her shoulder with one hand and palmed the orb with the other. It continued to resonate in her hand, and she didn't want to let it go for fear it might not start again. She was finally back home. It was time to see what this was all about. So, do we just stand here looking at it, or do we go in? Box asked. Evie gave him the side-eye, though she doubted he realized it. She took the first 2 steps up to what used to be the front door and stepped over the threshold, the charred remains of what had been inside crunching under her boot. She could picture the house in her mind, with a large open foyer in the front and stairs leading to the second floor, while the kitchen and conservatory were through the hallway that led under the 90-degree turned stairway. To her right, where an open room and wall should have been, stood only the charred framing with a few polycarbonate supports still up. It didn't seem as if the fire had occurred too long ago. The dust and sand would have settled more. Sisk was known for its dust storms, which came through at least 6 times a season, which meant the fire must have come through within the last 60 or 90 days. It was too fresh otherwise. "Hello?" Evie asked, even though she could see the rubble. The orb's vibrations intensified. She couldn't let go of it now, not unless she wanted to lose everything. It had wanted her to come here, to see this. But why? She took a few more steps forward through what would have been the connecting hallway to the back of the house. A strange duality played in her mind. Not only did she see this place as it had been in her youth, but she also saw it as she had in her hallucinations. This was always the last place she would come with Sester. And there, in the desk that used to sit against the far wall when she walked into what used to be the kitchen, would be some strange creature, not quite human, and not quite Athru either. But it always wore a black robe, and had on occasion seemed otherworldly to her. But now that she was here, there was no desk. It had been destroyed long ago, or perished in the fire, and there was no hooded figure to meet them. Nothing but a burned-out shell of a home where she'd once laid down her head. Evie glanced up to what would have been her bedroom, as it was situated over the kitchen, and was greeted by nothing more than the bluish-green sky above and Hammel's unrelenting rays beating down on them.
"I don't understand," she said, gripping the orb tighter. "There should be something here, something to explain all this."
"Should we start digging?" Box asked, surveying the rubble. "Perhaps what you're looking for was buried when the house burned down." She shook her head.
"I don't think so. I don't think this house was supposed to be destroyed. I saw it in my mind, just as I saw the Athru planet itself.
But that didn't turn out exactly like you thought, right? There was no hill you stood on." She swiveled to him.
"How do you know about that?"
Box was silent for a moment. Let's go with lucky guess." Evie narrowed her eyes.
"Cass told you, didn't he? That worm. I told him that in confidence."
No. He didn't tell me. I did a brain scan when you were out, and had a copy of your memories that I watched in my free time." Box tapped the ends of his long metal fingers together over and over, his eyes blinking wildly.
"You watched my memories? In your spare time?"
Evie said, deadpan. "Oh, yeah. I'm perverted. I love watching people's deepest secrets," he trailed off. She gave him a dismissive wave.
"It's fine. I should have guessed he couldn't keep his trap shut. Was there anything else he told you about me?"
"Despite my prying, no. He's remarkably tight-lipped about you. This was when he was trying to decide how to proceed as far as your memories were concerned. He was trying to work out if you prophesized the whole thing or if it was just coincidence." Box stopped tapping his fingers together and instead leaned back against one of the remaining polycarbonate supports.
"That's something, at least."
She looked around once more, willing herself to see something that wasn't there.
"I don't think what I'm looking for is here anymore. Maybe it was at one time, but something happened. I don't know what."
"Perhaps it was an accident," Box said, turning and leaving the same way they came, when he saw Evie heading back for the entrance. "And it's just bad luck."
"Maybe,"
she replied. She couldn't help but think something about all this felt wrong, though. It had felt right until they landed. Before that, it had felt very right. She was supposed to be on Sisk, and she was supposed to have the orb, and as best as she could tell, it had led her right here. So what was going on? "Don't worry, we'll keep looking," Box said, leading the way. Evie kept her head down, pondering the possibilities, and she didn't see Box had stopped ahead of her and ran right into his back. "Ow! What the—" She peered around him to see 4 Sisk security officers, each with a weapon drawn. Behind all of them was the Bedrew officer they'd encountered back in Lakal. She stared at them, and they stared back, unflinching and unforgiving.
"Shit."
5. Zenfor stared at the schematics before her, as she'd been doing for the past half hour. No matter how many times she tried to concentrate, her mind wouldn't stop wandering off on its own. It was a condition the humans called distraction, and one she'd become adept at over the past 18 years. There had been a time when nothing could have broken her concentration. Her focus was like a laser, always precise and on target. But in the year she'd been on the ship, it seemed she had picked up some undesirable habits, despite all her attempts otherwise. It wouldn't be long until her length of service aboard the Tempest would eclipse that on board Syl ships, at which time her conversion to full traitor would be complete. Commander Wolf had given her the opportunity to return to her people when the Tempest had first come back to Coalition space 14 years ago, and she'd refused. By that point, she had bonded herself to Sester and had become accustomed to the freedom being in the Coalition provided. Did that mean she had turned her back on her own people? Of course not. Or, at least that's what she told herself. But deep within, she knew the truth. The point of no return had long since been passed. Going back would mean inquiries and eventually death for abandoning her designated role as consul. Zenfor huffed and slammed her hands down on the control panel. Not enough to crack it, again, but enough so that she felt better. The truth was, she didn't miss the Sill. Not all that much. But she did miss her home planet. It would be difficult never seeing Thesleia again, and its beautiful night sky, or to traverse the familiar tunnels of the space beneath. But life on this ship had been good to her. It had given her the ability to expand her horizons past what she considered possible. Though she'd never admit it to anyone, she enjoyed it. She only wished Sester was here to enjoy it with her. Zenfor locked down her console and left the weapons bay, where she'd been working for the past 30 hours, without rest. Caspian had ordered her to spearhead a team to reproduce his custom-built boom cannon, as it seemed to be the only weapon effective against the Athru. And while she'd been working on it, she was distracted, which made the work go slow, and those few people she'd assigned to her team more annoying than they already were. 12 hours in, she'd dismissed them all before she ended up putting her fist through Alaksha's smug face. Maybe it wasn't her face. For all she knew, all Dorsai looked like that. But something about Alaksha's inquisitive demeanor had grated on her, and she didn't work well when she couldn't concentrate. Better to go it alone than risk causing an incident. Back when Caspian had confined her to quarters for assaulting Commander Geisen, she hadn't found the experience pleasant. She'd become too used to going where she wanted and when. It was in stark contrast to back when she and Meless had first come aboard, when it had been difficult to even prompt them to leave their room. But 18 years had a way of changing one's perspective. Zenfor could only hope Meless didn't suffer much when the Athru destroyed the Coalition. She'd been stationed on Starbase 8, the same one they left to go on their mission, which was only supposed to last 4 or 5 seasons at most. And here it was, nearly 2 decades later, where the companion she'd chosen had had decided to fall into a coma. She couldn't help but bite back her resentment. The door to engineering rolled away, and Zenfor headed for her station, trying not to look at the curled-up form of Sester off to the side of his massive cradle near the back of the room. More times than she could count, she tried to reach out to him, to find a way to break through the psychic barrier keeping his thoughts from leaking out, but each time finding it too strong. If he was still in there, his barriers were unbreakable. She hadn't consulted Zax, but it was possible he died in there, and only his living shell remained, barely registering on any medical device. Had it been up to Zenfor, she wouldn't allow this to continue. But he'd been very clear, and she needed to respect his wishes. That was what this whole thing had been about. The torment he'd undergone finding out the Coalition had collapsed, and his people were most likely subjugated. She didn't think she could imagine what that felt like, and she didn't care to. If only he were dead, perhaps she might be able to clear her thoughts. But the whole problem was he was still there, still within her orbit, despite the barriers. She saw him every day, and every day she was reminded of what she'd lost. It was maddening. "Hey, Zen?" Zenfor slid her eyes to the side, just as she unlocked her engineering station. "Tyler. Sophie told me you dismissed everyone from the team. What's going on? Did you finish already? If I were finished, do you think I would be out here running structural analysis of composite materials?" she snapped, pulling up the schematics on her station. The truth was, she could do this in the weapons bay, but she needed a larger space around her. Weapons was too enclosed. Engineering was large and cavernous. She could already feel her pulse slowing. "Was there a problem with the team?" Tyler asked. "We could always assign new—" "The team was fine," she replied. "It is better if I do this on my own." "Ah," Tyler replied. She slid her eyes to the side. "What?" He was unperturbed. "Nothing." Zenfor took a deep breath. If there was one thing she had learned about humans, it was their relentless pursuit to make others happy. Tyler wouldn't leave this alone until he received a satisfactory answer. Otherwise, he would keep pestering her until he'd found a way to fix the situation. "I am almost finished anyway. Any other assistance would have been redundant." She tried to focus on the schematics in front of her. It wasn't as if this was a difficult project. But her mind only wandered to the next closest thing, which was Tyler's look of disbelief. "If there's nothing else, I'd prefer to finish this today." "Okay, but if you need to talk to someone about anything that might be bothering you, Your concern is unnecessary. Now leave me." She took a breath, remembering her manners. "Please." Tyler scoffed. "You may not think you need help sometimes, but you do." He turned to go. "And work on that, please." Had anyone else heard it, they would have taken it as a death threat. That's how it was meant, she thought. She hated Tyler knew so much about her. It had come as a natural side effect of them spending so much time together. He'd been out of stasis longer than any other human, nearly 12 years. And he'd spent most of that time in engineering, helping her to redesign the undercurrent system. It worked perfectly. But the unfortunate side effect was she had made a friend. She allowed him to walk away. Any further interaction would only encourage similar behavior in the future. It had been harder than she'd expected, getting used to the entire crew being back. For so long, she'd been able to roam the empty corridors, reveling in her solitude. But now she could barely take a step outside engineering without running into someone. And the only place she seemed to find any solace were her quarters. And yet there, she felt closed off and trapped. Perhaps that was why she had been more irritable ever since returning to Coalition space for a second time. Not to mention, it put them near Sill space again. Back when they'd been in orbit of that planet, her home had seemed so far away, almost as if it was out of reach. But here, using their advanced drive, it wouldn't take more than a few days to reach the border. There might even be Sill ships close, exploring what used to be Coalition territory, though it was doubtful. The walls of the Sill Alliance had stood for 10,000 years, never growing, never shrinking. There was no reason to think they would start now. Zenfor took a deep breath and tried to focus on the images and text in front of her. But she only ended up staring into space. 6. Human, place your hands on top of your head. You are under arrest. Robot, drop all weapons and extend your arms out to your sides. You are also under arrest. Evie grumbled under her breath. What the hell was the Sisk security force doing here? Had they been following them ever since Lakal? And if so, how had they managed to do it without them noticing? "We didn't do anything," she yelled, using Box as a shield. His body could take the impact from their weapons. Probably. "Evie, do I initiate bodyguard procedures?" Box whispered. "Your presence on Sisk is disruptive to the native population," one of the officers called out. Something sparked in Evie's memory, but she couldn't be sure what. "Then why did you let us land?" she called back. "Come out from around the machine with your hands on top of your head. Do not resist, and do not give us a reason to fire." Something in the officer's voice sounded urgent. It was a kind of urgency Evie recognized that could potentially set off a powder keg. Her best option was to comply. There was no way Box had enough sedative in his "Citizen, move away." Evie had to clamp her hands over her ears, otherwise she thought her eardrums might burst. The orb fell to the ground, rolling a few meters away. Box's warning continued on repeat. She glanced around him again to see 3 of the officers covering their own ears. But the 4th, Acrylic, still had his weapon trained on them. Acrylics had only rudimentary auditory canals, preferring to communicate by hand signal or visual medium. Box's warning would do no good against him.
"Box, call it off," she yelled over the din of his booming voice. "It's not working."
"Oh?" Box asked, his sonorous voice gone. "I thought it was quite effective." Evie removed her hands from her ears.
"I think a class in the functions of all the different species on this planet before we came down might have been helpful."
"It's not my fault I wasn't properly briefed."
"Last warning."
Evie glanced back to the group. They'd all trained their weapons on them again. And now Evie was out of cover, having needed to get within Box's visual range to shut him up. She cursed and slowly raised her hands. She needed to find the orb again. But instead, her eyes focused on one individual in particular, standing off to the right. He was Ashkazian, and now she realized why his voice had sounded familiar.
"Runak?"
she prompted, not needing the confirmation. It was him, all right. The dark blue scales, the short tank-like body with a long tail, and those dark orange eyes she remembered staring into as a child. She was glad to see he'd become a security officer. He always had been a good soul. Though her heart panged a little upon realizing he'd been stuck on this planet while she traveled the stars. Runak squinted, and when he did, she could see how similar he was to the Bulak if he turned just the right way. It was the same thing she'd seen in Vrij.
"Evelyn?"
He took a step closer.
"It can't be. You're too young for a human."
She shook her head.
"It's me. I've been through a few strange events recently. I can't—" "How have you survived?" he asked.
"It's a very long and complicated story," she said.
"One that you are not privy to,"
Box added in one of his accents.
"Top-level brass only."
Runak glanced at Box, then back at Evie, his face awash with concern.
"I'm sorry to do this, but we have to arrest you. As I'm sure you know, humans are outlawed on Sisk."
He turned to Box.
"As are any collaborators."
Box made a noise like he was inhaling sharply, despite not having lungs.
"I didn't know," Evie replied. "But if it's illegal for me to be here, why allow us on Sisk at all?" "That was my supervisor's idea,"
Runak said, motioning with his head to the Bedru officer behind the line, the same one they met in the streets.
"He wanted to make sure you weren't meeting other humans. If we had a secret cell anywhere on the planet, it would put us all at risk. Now, please."
He flicked his weapon up, and Evie huffed, placing her hands on her head.
"Do what they tell you," she said to Box.
"Wow. I am a terrible bodyguard," he said to no one in particular. He extended his arms out to the side. Evie caught the glint of the orb on the ground, and immediately had the urge to grab it. If she focused, she might move fast enough to avoid their blasts. But then what? Once it was back in her possession, what was she supposed to do? Leave Box there by himself? Take on 5 Sisk security officers by herself? The last time she'd done something like that, the wrong people had died. And these officers were just doing their duty.
"It's because of the Athru, isn't it?" she asked.
Runak nodded.
"Who else?" "I don't guess you just let us get back in our shuttle and leave. We have a ship in orbit."
"We know," the Bedru officer said, his voice carrying over the other officers. "All planetary traffic was ceased the moment you came into the system. We will not risk Sisk for the likes of a rogue human. Once we have transmitted the circumstances of your death to your ship, they will leave." Something like a chuckle bubbled out of Box, though it was mechanical and oddly even in its nature. "You don't meet many humans, do you? Killing her will only enrage them. You'd be asking for a minor war if you allow anything to happen to either of us." Runak turned to his commander.
"Sir, maybe we can just—"
"No mercy will be given, Runak. You know the law. We must take care of this before the syndicates get word of it." "Unless you want another incident on your record," the Bedru said. Runak cast his eyes downward, but his face was turned in a snarl.
No, sir.
He approached Evie, cautious, but with his weapon pointed to the ground.
I'll need to put you in restraints so we can take you to the station. You'll be processed, then put to death. Just let us leave. The Athru don't need to know, she said. If all those years we spent together as kids meant anything, just let us go.
What are you even doing on Sisk in the first place? He asked, stopping a meter in front of her and stowing his weapon. He withdrew a set of electronic cuffs.
I came looking for answers, she replied. What happened to this place?
He leaned forward, but a metal hand shot out between his face and Evie's. That's close enough, hot stuff, Box said. The sound of weapons charging filled Evie's ears, and she froze.
Box, pull your hand away. Slowly.
Evie gritted her teeth. Box looked at the firing line, then back at Evie. He retracted his hand, moving it back to its original position. Lieutenant, get that robot in some restraints, the Bedrew said. The Kryllic officer pulled out 2 sets of electronic cuffs and shuffled over to Box, his long, spindly legs carrying him quickly over the ground.
I never said anything,
Runak said, placing the cuffs on Evie's wrists as he brought them down in front of her.
They wanted to rid the planet of any perception of help. About 6 months ago, they found out you used to live here. Within a day, they moved the people out and raised it.
6 months. That was about 2 seasons in Coalition time, and that matched up with the amount of dust she'd seen of the house. They destroyed it just because at one point she'd lived there? Talk about overkill. Runak led her away from the front of the house, and she looked back to the orb laying on the ground. She had to figure a way out of this. She hadn't come through hell just to be summarily executed on her home planet. They might have no choice but to overpower the officers. Evie glanced at Box, who looked at her for instruction. The Kryllic had bound both his hands and legs, but if she recalled, the electronic cuffs probably wouldn't hold against him.
Again, I'm sorry about
this, Runak said, leading her away and to their patrol transports.
Yeah.
She only hoped this time they could get away without killing anyone. Just as she was about to signal Box, there was a sonic boom overhead, causing all of them, security officers too, to look up. Evie gasped when she recognized the ships.
Coming through the atmosphere now, Captain,
Rivers said, controlling the shuttle. Inside, Cass and Talia armed themselves with pulse weapons, and Cass double-checked his boom cannon that he'd retrieved from the lockup of the ship. It was fully loaded, and it was the only thing that he'd found could kill the Athru. For some reason, Zenfor still hadn't finished replicating the design for mass production yet. Caspian, to all ships. Keep an eye out for surprises. We don't know what they might have up their sleeves, and we don't want to be caught off guard. He adjusted his holster so the boom cannon fit snug under his arm, right where Cass liked it. How are we supposed to watch out for anything if they can hide inside time? Ryant asked over the comm. Cass glanced to his left. 3 space wings flew in formation outside the window. To his right, 3 more. Saturina had scrambled all the remaining space wing pilots for the mission.
Quit your whining, Ryant, Edra Blackfield chimed in. If they know there are humans here, they'll come out.
Couldn't have put it better myself, Cass said, focusing on the call ahead of them. His heart hammered in his chest. But truth be told, he was glad to be out of the ship. Hank had nearly had a heart attack trying to keep him on the bridge. But this was Evie, and Cass wasn't going to abandon her a second time.
Sir, I'm getting some comm traffic. They're telling us to return to our ship and leave Sisk territory, Rivers said, pointing to the info coming across the shuttle scanner. Looks like they decided to get chatty all of a sudden, Talia said. She'd strapped a pulse rifle to her back and had a pistol version ready in hand. Do you have a lock on Evie and Box? Cass asked. River pointed to a small dot on the screen ahead of them. Just pick them up. They're outside the city in a rural district. I think it's the house the captain pointed us to originally. Of course. Cass had figured it would be the first place she'd go. Whatever that orb was telling her, it was leading her somewhere,
and in conjunction with her hallucination showing the ghost or whatever it was of her father in her old house, it made sense that would be her first stop. Any indication of why we can't contact them?
There's a jamming field in place.
Talia accessed one of the side consoles.
Looks Sisk in origin.
Let me guess, Cass said. No sign of the Athru.
Nothing yet.
He shook his head. They'd hide until the last minute, hoping to ambush their prey. If Samaya was right and they had ships in orbit or on the surface, they wouldn't reveal their hand until it was necessary. Cass's plan was to land, grab Box and Evie, then get the hell off this planet and out of the system before the Athru could pursue. He wasn't leaving anyone behind.
Captain?
River turned in her seat, indicating the primary scanners. Cass leaned over the console, reading the information.
Rings? I hope you're ready for this, he said into the comms.
Ahead of them, a small fleet of Sisk patrol craft approached from Lakal.
Ah, he called you Rings,
Ryan said.
Stow it, Saturina said. Captain, you and I are going to discuss decorum when we return to the ship, she said,
the menace in her voice unmistakable.
Until then, yeah, we got this. Go get our people. Wing 1, engage the hostiles. Wing 2, protect the shuttle.
3 of the Space Wings pulled ahead of them, aiming at the approaching swarm.
Where do you want me to set down? River asked.
Right on top of them. Don't even cut the engines. The ensign and I will jump out and grab them, then straight back to the ship. Understood?
Yes, sir,
River replied, setting the coordinates. The shuttle pitched down, headed straight for the surface. Cass estimated they were probably traveling twice the speed of sound. Weapons fire peppered the hull.
Armor is holding for now.
Talia took a seat and configured the station for tactical.
But without offensive weapons, it's up to the Space Wings to keep them off us.
Remind me when we get back to put you in charge of getting some guns on these damn things, Cass said, grabbing the nearest handhold as the ship shook from the blasts.
Sorry, River said. This is going to be bumpy.
Cass noticed her mechanical fingers had split from 10 into 20, so she could more accurately control the rate of descent. They moved so fast he could barely keep up.
We've engaged them, Saturina yelled. Utley, break off from the shuttle and get up here to help us. These bastards are everywhere.
Cass craned his neck up to see the Space Wings engaged in a dogfight with the Sisk ships, pulse blasts firing everywhere.
Acknowledged, Chief,
Utley said, and one of the Space Wings escorting Cass's shuttle peeled off, headed back up.
1 minute, River said. I can see them, but...
What? Cass asked, leaning forward. He could see the dots of houses spread out along the long road, but he couldn't yet make out individual details. But River's ocular enhancement made it so she could.
They've got trouble. Sisk security has them in cuffs.
What the fuck is going on here? Cass said to himself. First they get an Athru signal, and as they're coming down to rescue their crewmates, they find the Simulus are all over the place, and we're the ones blocking their signal. Still no sign of the Athru? River shook her head.
Nothing but Simulus down there, she said.
Fine, Cass said, pulling out his boom cannon and switching it to the pulse setting. If he had to take out some Sisk security officers instead of an Athru army, that was fine with him, as long as they got off this planet before someone decided to blow it up. River performed a perfect maneuver of the shuttle, bringing the nose up at just the last second and extending the landing gear so they would land right in front of the Sisk vehicles. The move stirred up a lot of dust, and everyone outside the shuttle covered their eyes, save Box, who only looked at the shuttle, his eyes blinking in the pattern that normally meant ecstatic. Like I said, keep it running, Cass yelled as River opened the primary hatch in the back. Dust scattered everywhere, peppering Cass's face. He had to cover his own eyes as he and Talia ran out into the fray, their weapons out. This was a lot more dust than he would have expected. He took aim at the first person he saw, a long-legged Simulist he didn't recognize, but it had tiny eyes and was already wiping them clear from the dust. The blast hit him square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and sending him flying backward. Cass only hoped the setting was low enough not to kill him. He hadn't taken the spindly creature's weight into consideration. Box, grab Evie. We need to go, he yelled into the dust storm. He couldn't see what was what, and with the shuttle's engine still running and kicking up dirt, it might never settle. but that worked to his advantage. Above him, the space wings that had escorted the shuttle buzzed the surface, their weapons blazing. He didn't know how long Saturina could hold them off, and he didn't want to find out. "Boss!" Box called back from somewhere in the dust. Purple flashes lit up the cloud. "They're firing at us!" "For course sake," Cass mumbled. "Ensign, head around and flank them. We don't have time." Talia, barely visible in the cloud with her hand shielding her eyes, nodded and disappeared into the dust. Cass glanced up to see a large shadow approaching through the dirt. At first, he thought it might be Box. But when the one-eyed, four-legged, teeth-ridden creature emerged, screaming at him and galloping at full speed, Cass screamed himself, falling back and firing 4 times at the thing. The first 2 hits glanced off him, but 3 and 4 connected, and he went down, face and long nose first, into the dirt, his back legs lifting up as his face skidded to a stop. He slumped over, his eye closed, and caked with dirt. What in the hell was that? He asked no one, though he was having flashbacks of the bear things from the Athru planet. Though this creature wasn't nearly as large. "That," said a female voice, "was a bedrew." A hand with a broken cuff dangling from the wrist reached down and helped him up. Evie grinned, though her clothes were covered in dirt. "I guess I should have paid more attention in exobiology," Cass replied. "Box? Ensign, we need to go." He turned back to Evie. "Are you okay?" She held up her wrists with the broken cuffs. "No worse for wear. But I have to go back for the orb. I dropped it." He shook his head. "There's no time. Saturnina's barely keeping it together up there. We need to get back to the ship." "Cass," she said, warning in her voice. It was a tone that told him she wasn't going back without it. "Fine." He checked the boom cannon again. Full charge. "Let's make it quick." She ducked low, and he stayed with her as she navigated the dust, seeming to know exactly where she was going. Cass couldn't tell where they were, though the dust was thinning, which meant they had to be moving away from the shuttle. "It's here somewhere," she said, her eyes plastered to the ground. Cass kept looking behind them to make sure none of the other security officers were following. He didn't see Evie stop, and he ran right into the back of her. "What the?" He stopped and looked ahead of them to a figure in a dark robe, its long gray hand outstretched, and in it, the orb. "Looking for this?" it asked. With its free hand, it pulled back the hood of its robe to reveal the unmistakable features of an Athru. 7. Evie stared at the creature before them. There was no mistaking it. It belonged to the same race of creatures that had detained and tortured her on the planet, who had destroyed the Bulak homeworld, and who had decimated the Coalition nearly 2 decades ago. And yet, there was something different about this Athru. Embedded in the center of its forehead was what seemed to be a pink crystal in the shape of a diamond. Evie couldn't tell if it was ornamental or embedded deeper, but it seemed to almost hum with energy similar to the orb that now sat in the outstretched hand of the alien. Its long gray fingers were straight out, but Evie was sure if she tried to take the orb, those fingers would clasp around her wrist, and something terrible would happen. "Back up." Cass aimed his boom cannon directly at the alien, his gaze intense. "Drop the orb and back away." "My, you are a fierce friend, aren't you, Caspian?" the Athru said. And for the first time, Evie heard it as female, not just a generic it. "How do you know my name?" The Athru seemed to make a dismissive motion with her shoulders. "Your exploits are well known. Who hasn't heard of Captain Caspian Brabo?" Cass's face was awash in confusion. "What?" The Athru leaned forward, but his grip on the weapon had loosened. "All of my people know your name. You're infamous." "Now, wait a second," Evie said, stepping in between them. "Who the hell are you?" She tensed her body, preparing for a fight. If she had Athru blood running through her veins, she had a good chance of stopping this one, as it appeared she was alone. The Athru's face softened, and she smiled. "Evelyn, I am so glad to meet you. I'm Esterva.
Your mother. Your true mother. My mother?
Evie said. It felt like the world was spinning away from her, like she was being yanked from reality back into her hallucinations. Could she dare to hope? She'd spent so long searching for information on her mother that she'd abandoned the prospect to oblivion. But then, after what had happened with Osborne and the name he'd given her, Amanda Lawson, she thought her search was over, despite the fact there was virtually no information on Amanda Lawson at all. And then she'd ended up in that pyramid, where the Athru had told her the truth. But as she stared into the eyes of the tall alien standing in front of her, she couldn't believe it was real. After so many false starts and broken hopes, did she dare to believe what was staring her in the face? What if she was unconscious or dreaming? What if she was still unconscious, stuck in that stasis unit on Tempest?
I promise I will explain everything if you'll convince your friend here not to kill me.
Evie pushed Cass's weapon the rest of the way down, so it pointed at the ground without hesitation. He only gave a small amount of resistance, seeming somewhat dazed himself. Esturva smiled.
But first, we have some housekeeping to take care of.
For some reason, Evie thought she meant the actual house behind them. But instead, she glided past them, depositing the orb in Evie's hand, while a strange sound seemed to emanate from beneath her robes. The dust settled, and Evie finally got a good look at the battlefield. Box and Talia were hunched down behind one of the security vehicles, while the 3 remaining security officers fired at them from 3 different positions, having pinned them down in one place. The Krillic officer lay off to the side, as did the Bedru, both of their faces in the dirt. She could see Ensign River through the paint of the shuttle, holding it in place as it hovered slightly off the ground. She'd assumed the shuttle had made the dust storm, but had it been this Athru? And how sure could Evie be that she was who she said she was?
I appreciate all this effort,
Esturva said in perfect universal, something that Evie found odd, as the others she'd met spoke in their own language.
But there is no need to execute these humans today.
Runak turned, and upon seeing Esturva, immediately dropped his weapon, his body going stiff.
"Oh, my core,"
he said. He fell to his knees, bowing his head before her.
"Please. We didn't know they were coming. We weren't going to kill them, I promise."
Evie couldn't help but feel a strange indignation at hearing her former childhood friend was willing to murder her so easily, just for the crime of setting foot on this planet. The other 2 officers had stopped firing as well, but hadn't prostrated themselves in front of Esturva like Runak had. Now was their chance to get away.
"Talia, Box, get to the shuttle,"
Evie yelled, stepping forward. Talia made a dash, but Box only stood, looking at Esturva, his eyes a solid yellow. Evie glanced to her side, where Cass seemed to have come back to his senses. A scowl formed on his face, and he raised his weapon to Esturva's back. Evie stepped between them again.
"You can't."
He stared at her with an incredulous expression. "She's an Athru."
"She's my mother. I mean, she might be. And I didn't come all this way for you to kill her."
"How can you be sure? It's not like they never lied to you before." He wasn't dropping the weapon, but he wasn't trying to get around her either.
"I don't know. I just want to hear her out first," Evie said.
She had no reason to believe this woman, other than the fact she hadn't tried to kill them yet, and hadn't subjected Evie to any torture techniques. Not to mention, the orb had led her here. This had to be the reason.
"Thank you, Evelyn. I appreciate that,"
Esturva said, still facing the Cis guards.
"Officer
Runak," he said, glancing up from the ground.
"Officer Runak, please collect your associates and leave. I have this under control," Esturva said.
Runak stood, stowing his weapon in his belt.
I'm sorry. I can't do that. The law states all humans on the surface are to be put to death. I need to take them into custody. These humans are not part of that doctrine. On my order," Esturva said.
Runak seemed to be struggling with something internally, as his face went through a few different emotions.
I'm sorry, Great One, but I feel like you are testing me. And if I don't kill these humans, you will deem us collaborators and destroy our planet. Now, what would give you that idea? Esturva asked. Because the Athru are ruthless in their goal. When you spared our planet, you told us in no uncertain terms the nature of the agreement. Any humans were to be eliminated. If we did this, we could continue to live in peace. A thought struck Evie, and seeing Cass had become interested in this exchange and dropped his weapon again, she turned to Runak. How many humans have you killed, Rune? Over the past 18 years, how many? Enough to save countless lives on this planet, Runak replied, indignant. I'm sorry, Evie, but your people are a plague, and I'm not sacrificing every symbolist on Sisk just to keep a few humans alive. He drew his weapon again, pointing it at her. Officers, kill all the humans. Esturva stepped forward. I don't think you understand me. If you harm this woman or any human in your immediate proximity, I will have no choice but to enact our final solution. Do I make myself clear? Runak screwed up his features. I don't understand, Great One. You're serious. I am not to kill these humans? No. You wouldn't disobey a direct order, would you? Runak glanced around. One of the other officers, also an Askazian, had his sights on Cass. But his hand trembled, and his finger hovered precariously close to the trigger. In a flash, Esturva was beside him. The weapon was gone from his hand, and his neck sat at a strange angle, almost as if he didn't realize what had happened to him yet. As his mind caught up to the trauma his body had endured in those few milliseconds, he fell to the ground, immobile. Now, Esturva said, do you understand? Something flared in Runak's eyes, but he stowed his weapon again and turned to his remaining companion. Grab the others. We need to leave now. Esturva pointed above them. And call off the aerial attacks. Runak ground his long teeth and tapped a small device on his wrist. Air units, stand down. Return to base. But, sir, don't argue with me, Genoa. Just pull back and return to the station, Runak screamed. Gone was the man of composure Evie had seen only a few minutes ago. It seemed time had not been as kind to him as he first assumed. How could he have gone so wrong? Back when they were children, he had championed Sisk becoming part of the coalition. It was part of why they hung out so much. He'd always been interested to see places and people beyond Sisk, to get out and explore the galaxy, to learn about new and interesting cultures. But she could see now he had stayed right where he was and shrunk to fit this small place instead of expanded. Gone was the bright, curious child she'd known, and standing in his place was a scared, ruthless man. A man who would murder innocent people just because he was told to. Evie may not be perfect, but at least she hadn't fallen that far. Runak and his remaining officer took a few minutes to gather their 3 fallen compatriots, including the one Esturva had killed, and stowed them in the transports. The small group watched them depart down the dusty road until they came to the main thoroughfare and headed back to the city. Is everything okay down there? Jan asked. Evie turned to see Cass answering his comm. I don't know yet. Send one of the squads down to land, and the other back to the ship. Be right down, Jan replied. Above them, 3 space wings set themselves into formation, then descended until they hovered above the desert floor. They landed with a soft thump. The cockpit of the ship in the middle opened up, and Saturina Jan stood up, her eyes wide. Holy! Her hands went to her controls. Cass walked past Evie with his hands up. Hold your fire, for now. We're still assessing the situation. Jan shook her head. This is lunacy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one of the aliens who tried to kill us back on that planet? Cass nodded, his hand still up. That's what we're trying to find out. He turned back to Evie. Well? Evie addressed Esturva, who was now looking at her, smiling. Are you really my mother? Yes. How do I know you're not lying?
Esterva paused, the smile not changing.
If you're looking for me to produce a special talisman that makes everything clear, I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. Trust takes time, and I'm willing to spend that time with you to convince you I am telling the truth. Why are you here?
She placed her long fingers together, holding her hands in front of her.
Let me guess. Marshall is dead?
How did you know that? Cass asked. Evie noticed his weapon was still out, though no longer pointed at anyone. Behind him, Box and Talia came walking up. Talia's weapon was out as well. Esterva pointed to Evie's hand.
His beacon. It would only go off if something happens to one of us. Otherwise, we only meet at pre-planned times and places. He was set to return here, and when I got the signal, I knew I would find you.
You're the Athru we picked up. Cass regarded her for a moment before turning back to Evie. It's why we came down to get you. Some Maya picked up Athru signals near your location. We thought it was a trap. Esterva raised her almost indiscernible eyebrows.
Had it been a deception from my people, you never would have survived.
Her eyes, like all Athru, were large and set further up on her long head. Her nose and mouth were smaller than a human's, though she was at least as tall as Zenfor, if not taller. But there was something different about her from the other Athru they'd met, though Evie couldn't quite put her finger on it. She didn't look like Rockron, or the Athru that had attacked them on the planet. For one thing, she was wearing clothes. All the others had been naked.
Still, I didn't anticipate you picking up my signal, Esterva said, cutting her eyes to Cass.
She turned back to Evie, her tone lighter.
Marshall and I deliberately agreed on this location in case of emergencies, and I mourn his loss. He was a loyal member of our group. I figured if anything ever happened to him, leading you here would give you a sense of security. The only drawback being that the planet is very hostile to humans.
Wait, Cass said. Just so I understand, you know about Marshall, and you claim to be Evie's mother. But how does that make you different from all the others? Why aren't you trying to kill us right now?
Because killing you is not my goal. I belong to a rogue sect of Athru, she said, scanning the group. We do not believe in the destruction of humanity. Quite the opposite. We are explorers who wish to understand your species better. The rest of the Athru do not approve, so we must work in secret. Though I will say we strive to know some humans more than others.
She eyed Cass. He seemed to let the comment pass, though Evie sensed a lot of hostility coming from Esterva, all of it directed at Cass. Was that normal for an Athru? She'd only had the opportunity to speak to one other, but at the time she hadn't been in any state of mind to assess his emotional state. Being restrained to a stone table tended to ratchet up her panic levels. But it begged the question, if this was her mother, and she'd been in contact with Marshall, where had she been the past 31 years?
Why now? Why show up after all this time? She asked.
Esterva hesitated, her small lips drawn in a line.
After everything that happened, and my people's invasion of your territory, I fear we don't have much time left. I've been waiting 18 years for an update. Before the beacon was activated, I had to assume you and everyone on your ship was dead, though I could find no evidence of the ship's destruction. I've spent the last 2 decades attempting to track you down.
So then, what is it you want? Cass asked.
Isn't it obvious? I thought my presence here was clear. I'm here to help you find a way to destroy my species.
8. Can I speak to you a moment? Cass pulled Evie aside so they were out of what he could only assume was the Athru's hearing range. For all he knew, she had the hearing of a Garuffian. But they couldn't walk 2 kilometers away to speak.
What?
Evie hissed, once they were just beyond Saturnina's space wing. Are you buying this?
She hesitated. I'm not sure. She knows about Marshall. Only someone in contact with him would know he wasn't human, right?
I think any Athru might know. I think they have an extrasensory perception toward each other. Didn't you tell me back on that planet you could feel them around you? She shook her head.
That could have been Dagnya messing with me. There's so much I'm not sure about with her.
Do you feel anything like that toward her? He looked back over his shoulder. Esturva stared at the two of them, the ends of her small mouth upturned. I mean, what if she's nothing more than a mole trying to get aboard the ship? Think about it. The last coalition ship, the only one that can outrun the Athru. It has to be a tempting target.
I agree. We can't just take her on her word. But you heard her. It isn't like she can prove she is who she says she is. And if she's offering to help us, can we afford to refuse her?
Cass had to suppress a grin. I had the same thought about Diamant, and we both know how that turned out. Not so easy when you're the one under the gun, is it? She scoffed.
Just because you're a terrible judge of character doesn't mean I am. I had my concerns about Diamant from the beginning. But this feels different. I don't know. But I think you're right. We need more to go on.
Satisfied, Cass nodded and returned with Evie back to the group. He noticed Talia hadn't taken her eyes off Esturva, and her weapon was still drawn. But if the alien could move as fast as she had against the Sisk officer, none of them had a chance.
Finished?
Esturva narrowed her eyes at Cass. We need more, Cass said. We're not about to let you on the ship without some kind of assurance you can't or won't destroy us. Esturva regarded him.
Direct? And who said anything about returning to your ship? I have a perfectly capable craft of my own, stowed not far from here. I neither need your permission nor your approval, and I can leave whenever I wish.
She turned, the diamond embedded in her forehead catching the light and sparkling. Sweat ran down Cass's back. It was only getting hotter out here.
Wait.
Evie took a step forward.
You understand our concerns, right? Especially given our history with your people, with my people.
Esturva faced her, holding out her hand.
May I see that orb of yours?
Evie plucked it from her pocket and placed it in her hand. Immediately, runes appeared on the orb and glowed a light blue. Cass's eyes went wide, and he reached for his weapon, nodding to Talia.
Wait.
Evie held her hands out. The glow on the orb faded until it was black again. Esturva handed it back to Evie.
My poor, strong daughter, she said. You've been through so much. I am so sorry.
She reached out for Evie, but thought better of it and withdrew her hand.
What do you mean? How much do you know about me? Evie asked.
Cass motioned for Talia to lower her weapon. Neither Evie nor Esturva were paying them any more attention.
The orb was not just a beacon, but an information-gathering device. It was how Marshall kept me up to date on your activities. It took his thoughts and memories and recorded them, allowing me to absorb them. You've been up to a lot since I last received an update.
Which was when? Cass asked. He was curious to find out if any other spies had been present on the ship.
More than 18 years for me, but only about 3 seasons ago for you, Esturva huffed, not masking her annoyance. Before she was sent on her mission to find you.
Had it only been that long for him? Cass could have sworn it had been years since Evie had shown up at Devil's Gate. He had a hard time picturing the same self-absorbed ass sitting at one of the stools, drinking his meager wages away from a job he couldn't escape. It was as if that life had belonged to someone else.
So, then you've seen everything I've ever done? Evie asked, staring at the black orb in her hand. Not everything. Those early years I was away and didn't get back often. My updates became more regular once you became a teenager. I trusted your father could take care of you, and I allowed him to. So then he really was my father, Evie said in a small voice.
It wasn't a question, and it wasn't aimed at Esterva or anyone else. Instead, it had been meant for her, Cass thought.
"Did you doubt it?" Esterva asked.
Cass couldn't help but remember when he had to plow into Evie's father to get him off her. How such a frail wisp of a man had been so strong, he still didn't know. Evie glanced around. Everyone had their eyes on them at the conversation. Cass tried to motion to her not to say anything else. He knew how fiercely she guarded her privacy, and in this emotionally compromised moment, she might say something she'd end up regretting. She blinked a few times, regaining her composure.
"I think we should let her on the ship."
Cass winced. He didn't want to argue with her out here in front of everyone and under this oppressive star. But allowing Esterva to come aboard Tempest was a massive security risk, and now that he was captain, he wasn't sure he could authorize such a move. He addressed Esterva. "Is there anything else you can give us to prove you are who you say you are?"
"I'd be happy to submit to a medical test. I'm sure your technology has something that can confirm my daughter's lineage."
She said it with a bit too much saccharine in her voice for Cass's taste. Did she suspect they'd have to get her on the ship to perform the test? And by that point it would be too late? He wondered if he could bring Zax down here, have her bring the equipment she needed to make a proper determination. Cass glanced to the sky, squinting. The star had almost moved directly overhead. They needed to find some shade, and soon. Human bodies weren't designed to stay out in this heat long. Cass turned to look at Talia, who gave a very subtle shake of her head. He looked back behind him to Saturina and the other two pilots, standing beside their ships in what little shadow remained. Saturina squinted at him, but didn't offer an opinion one way or the other. Good. She was staying neutral. That was what she needed to do. Cass turned back around. "I've got an idea," Bach said. "Why don't we just sedate her before returning to the ship?"
"I think that's a little extreme,"
Evie said, the strength in her voice having returned.
"Don't you think if she was going to attack us, she would have done it by now? What's she waiting on? We're here, the ship's up there, and isn't going anywhere."
"Can you do that?" Cass asked. Bach shrugged. "I can try. I have a variety of sedatives which work on most humanoid beings. I'll just keep poking her until she faints."
"You will not,"
Esterva said, frowning.
"I don't know why I'm standing here listening to you anyway. It isn't as if you make the best judgment calls."
"Just what does that mean?" Cass asked, heat rising on his neck. She shook her head.
"It isn't important. What matters is I am offering my assistance. Do you want it or not?"
"Cass," Evie said. She had been with him on this only a few minutes ago. But in his opinion, the risk was too great. They were the last coalition starship as far as they knew, and they were the only ones with the technology to outrun the Athru. It was too much of a tactical advantage to risk on the word of one of their enemies. He shook his head.
"It seems your decision has been made," Esterva said, vitriol in her voice. "Good luck to the rest of you. I'm sure you'll all live long and fruitful lives under your captain's command." She turned to Evie. "You can accompany me if you like. We have a lot to catch up on."
But Evie wasn't paying attention. Instead, she was boring holes into Cass's head with her gaze. They weren't going to see eye to eye on this, but he had to do what was best for the ship and the crew. And despite the fact this woman had saved their lives, or at least prolonged them, allowing her on board was too risky.
"Yeah," Evie said. "I think I'll do that."
"You can't be serious," Cass said, stepping forward. "You're just going to abandon the rest of us to go off with this woman you barely know?"
"I do know her," Evie yelled. "I trust she is the woman she says she is. I don't know how to explain it. Something just feels right."
She held up a right hand and pulled the first finger down.
"She knows about Marshall."
Second finger.
"She knows about my father."
Third finger.
"She saved our lives and could have killed us whenever she wanted."
Fourth finger.
"And it doesn't help you're intimidated by her."
Cass pulled his lips between his teeth. I am not intimidated by her.
It's all right, Evelyn. You don't need to make excuses for me. Your captain has made his choice, and now we all must live with said choice. It's the wrong one. She addressed Cass again. What if she really can tell us how to beat them? Are you willing to give that up based on nothing more than the alternative involves a little risk?
It's more than a little, and you know it, Cass said, looking at her through hooded eyes. Cass glanced at Talia again, whose eyes were wide. This time she shook her head no more emphatically. But he couldn't rely on Talia to make this decision. He was the captain, and it was his call. If not bringing her aboard meant abandoning Evie, it changed the stakes. Despite their friendship, she was still a member of his crew. And he'd made an oath not to leave anyone else behind, which included her. "This is extortion," he said under his breath. "Very well. You may come aboard, provisionally, based on a medical exam. If the results bear out, you can stay." Esterva stepped forward, her features neutral.
"It seems you can make a rational decision after all."
"Meaning?"
"I think it can wait for another time," she replied, and glided past him toward the still-open shuttle, where Rivers stood at the back, one hand on the opening.
"No, please." "Indulge me," Cass said. Esterva stopped, then glanced over her shoulder.
"Very well. It was your actions that guided us to this point, and which brought your species to the brink of destruction. Had it not been for you, this entire war might have been avoided, and now it falls to me to clean up your mess."
9. How could his actions have led to this? How? By not being here when the Athru attacked? They were trying to preempt the attack, not cause it. The Athru were coming one way or the other. That much was clear from the long-range telescopes. Just because they didn't make it back with tactical information on them didn't mean it would have prevented the war. Are you saying if we'd returned with the information about your time bubbles or whatever you like to call them, this whole war would have been prevented? Esterva stopped in her place, turning on Cass and leaning down to look him in the eye. "Careful, boss," Bach said from somewhere off to his side. He didn't want to break her gaze. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction that she might see him distracted. But that didn't mean his right hand wasn't holding the butt of his boom cannon.
"Since you insist on going down this road, allow me to enlighten you. It is not your actions attempting to intercept my people, a venture that would have surely failed had it not been for dumb luck. No, I refer to the events in the depths of Sill space, where you refused to acquire a weapon that could have helped your people fend off an attack from a superior foe."
Cass furrowed his brow. "The Atlas?" Esterva nodded.
"The Atlas. Your desire to spare the lives of those Sill put your coalition at risk. Had you proceeded with the mission, perhaps your people would have had time to study the weapons more carefully, duplicate them, arm every ship and starbase with them. Perhaps those weapons would have been effective against my people. But I suppose we'll never know."
She clasped her hands in front of her once more. It was as if he was barreling through a fog of emotion, unsure which to feel first, so they all came at once. Anger, resentment, fury, guilt, pride, anxiety, fear, and the granddaddy of them all, regret. It didn't work anyway," he sputtered. "No matter what I did or didn't do." Though he knew now that was a lie. Samaya had taken a cue from his actions and sabotaged the weapon so it would backfire, making the powers that be think it was a fruitless exercise. But would she have taken that action if he'd never mutinied in the first place? He couldn't say.
"I'm confident, given enough time, your people would have figured it out. Who knows, with you there, being the engineer Marshall says you are, you might have even cracked the code yourself. But you decided 10 Sill lives were worth 2 trillion of your own. So, You'll excuse me if I don't necessarily trust your decisions."
It was like he had been stabbed in the heart. She had accused him of being the very thing he'd fought so hard to prove to everyone that he wasn't: a traitor. It wasn't like he invited the Athru to come invade. All he was trying to do was uphold the integrity of the institution he'd sworn to protect. Nothing more. How was he supposed to know the weapons they were trying to acquire, no, the weapons they were trying to steal, might assist in fighting off a superior foe? The Coalition had never faced anything like that in its 2,000-year history. What were the odds it would happen in his lifetime?
"My people are powerful, but they aren't invincible. Had you had those weapons at your disposal, it might have given you a fighting chance. But you were so ill-prepared, you never had the opportunity to find out." She smiled. "I'd say you, like you witnessed what happened. Which of course you didn't. Conveniently, you were away."
She turned and headed back to the shuttle.
"I'm not sure that's fair," Evie said.
Cass appreciated her standing up for him, as he was too flustered to respond.
"You don't have to defend him, Evelyn. His decisions were his own, and he must live with them. Come, we have much to discuss."
Evie shot one more look at Cass, but he turned away because all he saw was pity.
"Hey!"
Cass looked up to see Saturina had come up beside him. Box stood a few paces behind her. "If you're going to argue my case for me, you can save your breath." He didn't need to be patronized. Esturva was way off, and she knew it. You couldn't put the blame for an entire war at one man's feet.
"That's not what I was going to say. I just got a call from Takara."
She pointed up.
"She said she caught sight of a contingent of vehicles heading our way as she was heading back to the ship. You think the security changed their mind?"
"And go up against an Athru?" Cass asked, trying to compartmentalize Esturva's words into part of his brain he could analyze later. He wiped his brow. "They'd have to be suicidal. But I don't want to stick around and find out." He tapped his comm. "Tempest? Have you got eyes on us?" "Yes, Captain," Saul replied. "Keep it that way. We're coming back up with a guest, using the remaining space wings as an escort. I want full security to meet us when we arrive." "Understood." Cass ended the call.
"Bad idea,"
Talia said, walking by with a pulse rifle hanging from one hand. "What was that, Ensign?" Cass snapped, planting his feet. She stopped, frozen for a moment, before looking at him.
"Sorry, sir. Slip of the tongue."
"Is this going to be a problem? Do I need to find another chief of security?" Talia wiped her brow, her sleeve coming away soaked.
"No, sir. Won't happen again. I think it's this heat."
Cass stared at her a moment. "Make sure the Athru gets aboard the shuttle and is comfortable. I want eyes on her at all times." Talia nodded.
"Yes, sir."
She jogged off, following the others.
"That was good," Saturina said. "Nip that shit in the bud. I had to do the same thing with Utley when I took over. Started mouthing off like nothing had changed between us. When you're in command, it's always different."
"Yep," Cass said, Esturva's words still hanging in his brain.
"I sure hope you know what you're doing."
She slapped a hand on his shoulder. He barely registered it. "Me too." She nodded and headed back to her ship, motioning for the other two pilots to prep to move. Cass trudged toward the shuttle, which was still running at full power, as Box came up beside him. "What do we do about Calypso?" "Leave it," Cass said. They had plenty of shuttles, and he wasn't about to risk another incident over one small ship. "But it might have proprietary Coalition technology the Simulus aren't familiar with. Shouldn't we—" "Did you hear what I said?" Cass said, his tone clipped. "This isn't up for debate." "Yeah, okay," Box replied. When they were close to the edge of the shuttle, Cass stopped him. "I need you to act like a shield. You're the only one fast enough who might be able to stop her if she tries something. Stay close to her until we confirm her identity, and maybe even after that. There's too much at stake, understand? Box the living, breathing shield. Use him as you like. Need to fend off attackers? He can't be killed. He turned to Cass. Oh, wait. Yes, he can. Are you refusing an order? Cass asked. Box hesitated for a moment. Okay, but I get to administer the medical test, not Zach's. Fine. Box put out his hand. We have an accord, he said in a strange accent. Cass knocked it away. He wasn't in the mood. Instead, he climbed into the back of the shuttle where everyone else was already seated. Evie sat beside Esturva's statuesque form on the right side, while Talia sat opposite them, her weapon in her lap and her eyes trained on Esturva. Box shoved past Cass and plopped down beside Talia. Captain? I think we have trouble, Rivers said from the pilot's chair. Cass gave Esturva the side-eye as he walked past, but she only stared into space, as if he weren't even there. What sort of trouble? Hostiles. At least 20 headed this way. His eyes darted to the controls. Ground or air? Cass asked. Air. Those must have been the ones Captain Beard mentioned to Saturina. Get us back to the ship, and fast. He tapped his comm. Saturn, you see those? Yep. Do you want us to engage or protect the shuttle? Can you do both? I guess we'll find out. She ended the comm. River, what kind of makes are you getting on those units? Evie asked. 4 Type 6 slip speeders, 2 MKX hydrofoils, and at least 1 AM-55 Rhino, maybe 2. I can't tell from here. The others are smaller attack craft. Damn, Evie said under her breath. What? Cass asked. It's one of the local syndicates. Somehow they know we're here. They must have a mole inside the security forces. And they don't care about Athru law? Esturva asked. They don't care about any laws, Evie replied. One of the main reasons I wanted Sisk to enter the Coalition was so they could come through and wipe out all the rampant crime on this planet. Without a larger governing body, it's allowed to fester. When I was last here, there were only 3 competing mobs. There's no telling how many there are now. What do they want? Cass asked. Evie shrugged. Anything, everything. Ships, parts, hostages, slaves. No matter what they find, they'll manage to put her to use. Sounds like the Sargans, Cass said. Trust me. If they were on the other side of Coalition space, what used to be Coalition space, they would be. Can you outrun them? Cass leaned over the station beside Rivers. She shook her head. I don't know. Those are some serious mods. We might have trouble getting to the stratosphere. Her fingers split again and began working the controls faster. I'm going to try an erratic pattern to keep them off our tail. How do you know they're coming for us? Cass asked. Because we're the only target out here, remember? Evie said. Without any other traffic to blend into, we're easy pickings. This ought to be interesting, Esturva said. Hey, boss. I think she flinched a neck muscle, but I can't be sure. Could be the prelude to an altercation, Box said. Or I could have just been swallowing. But thank you for being so observant, the Athru replied. You're welcome, Box said. Cass rolled his eyes. Boss, she just smiled. Either she likes me or is about to kill me. I can't tell which. It's kind of an evil smile. I think... Box, shut up. Cass stared out the window as they lifted off, sending dust scattering. Esturva's motivations would have mattered if they didn't get back to the ship in one piece. The back hatch closed and cut off the intense heat that had been building outside. Cass had never missed standard life support so much in his entire life. Everyone, hang on. The negators may not be able to handle the G-forces, River said. Need some help? Evie asked. I wouldn't say no, she replied. Evie jumped up and took the station next to Rivers, forcing Cass back behind the main seats. The only one open was beside Esturva. Reluctantly, he sat down, slipping into his restraining harness. Talia did the same, while Box placed his hands and feet on the closest metal objects, the bulkheads, magnetizing himself to them. You better put on a harness unless you want to end up with a concussion, Cass said. If you even get concussions. I'll be fine, Esturva replied, remaining stoic with her hands folded in her lap. Cass shrugged. What did he care if her own stupidity gave her a head injury? At least then he wouldn't have to deal with another spy on board.
"Contact in 20 seconds, Rivers said. "Everyone, hang on."